What I'm going to do in the next 18 minutes is give you one person's view of the future of energy. But before I do that, I want to give you something to think about. Everybody in this room, because all of us have spent a goodly part of our life in a developed economy, have had the privilege of living in a time when the quality of life is the best it has ever been for the human race. And you have to ask yourself why that is. I would submit to you that the reason behind that is that we have all, in our generation, have had access to copious quantities of relatively affordable energy. The problem with the future is that that is about to change. And that's the theme of this talk. There are three big issues in the energy business today. The first one, as we all know, and we hear about it every day, is the relationship between the climate change that we see happening and the way we generate our energy. There's also the issue of the increasing risks involved with harvesting fossil fuel. Melissa mentioned the episode that happened in the Gulf of Mexico last year. My take on that is simply an indicator of the risks that human beings are prepared to take to perpetuate the lifestyle they have enjoyed. The same thing is true, by the way, of the Alberta oil sands. So the third thing, though, is the issue of the demand and supply of fossil fuel. That, I believe, is what's going to drive what will happen in the future of energy. The key question that comes up here is, when will the demand for energy exceed the conventional supply? Because when that happens, $100 oil will look cheap. Not only that, but the price of energy will become unstable. And energy and the supply of energy is what drives every economy in the world. What I've done in trying to get a handle on this is look at two scenarios. First of all, what I call the optimistic supply scenario. Now, the people that produce fossil fuels aren't very forthcoming about their reserves. So it's a bit of a mystery as to what the supply and demand equation really is. This stuff here is the German Advisory Council on Climate Change's view of what the supply of traditional energy looks like today. But as I said, nobody really knows. The thing that goes up to the right is the International Energy Agency's view of the growth of demand for energy. Now, in a place like Canada, our demand doesn't grow that rapidly. However, India, China, Brazil, Russia, they want our lifestyle, and you can't really deny it to them. That means that the demand for energy on this planet will continue to rise for the foreseeable future. Now, if you believe this is the future, then something unpleasant is likely to happen somewhere in the 2030 to 2040 time frame. However, there is another view, and that is the pessimistic view. It's essentially the same deal as the previous slide, except for the gas and oil numbers. All I did was take the gas and oil numbers from a different source. Everything else is the same. That source is the Association for the Study of Peak Oil and Gas. Now, these people are not a bunch of wild peak oil people, a bunch of retired petroleum geologists. They're trying to figure out what the heck is really going on here. If you believe them, and if they are right, and quite sincerely, I hope they're not, things start to get rough between 2012 and 2015. I think it's fair to say that those two scenarios probably bracket the reality of the future. But we really don't know the answer. But we better be prepared for it. The question that arises out of all this is, what will we do to fill the gap that is going to develop between the demand for energy and the conventional supply? Or are we simply going to let our prosperity and quality of life decline as the price of energy increases? That's our choice. How do we fill that gap? Well, I see two solutions. One is the increased use of nuclear energy, and the other is the entry of renewable energy sources and systems into the generation of mankind's energy. Here you see 9 of the common sources of renewable energy. Well, let's look at their properties. First of all, renewable energy is by definition inexhaustible because it's renewable, provided we manage the supply. Secondly, renewable energy is local energy. It's from your surroundings. Therefore, it's secure. And all the renewable energy sources, at least compared to drilling a few kilometers down in the sea and whatnot, is relatively easy to do and not very risky. And finally, the renewable energy sources, provided they're derived in the right way, tend to be environmentally benign. So it does deal with all 3 big issues today. But there is a problem. And that problem is that renewable energy sources are either intermittent or strongly location dependent or both. There is no silver bullet in this business. So how do we deal with it? There's a challenge here. And the challenge is, how can we create an energy system that's 100% renewable and at the same time generate firm renewable power anywhere on this planet? There are many people who will say that's not possible. I disagree with them. I believe it is. And the answer lies in combining different renewable source technologies having complementary properties that together can generate firm renewable energy. Now, what do I mean by firm energy? It's very simple. It's sometimes called dispatchable energy. What it means is when you throw the switch on the wall, by God, the light comes on. Most of us don't really appreciate how much infrastructure is behind that very simple thing. In other words, there's energy there when you demand it. Taking several renewable energy sources and putting them together to make them firm is what the challenge is. At one site in central Minnesota, you've got solar and wind through a year. They complement one another. The overall energy generation during that year is more constant than it would be from either one of those sources taken by itself. That's the first step. Now your challenge is to fill in the holes to make it firm. Let's look in a little more detail at the properties of renewable energy sources. First of all, are they intermittent or firm? Secondly, and this is an important parameter, is the cost of the fuel zero or not? Now, if you take the first 3 up there, solar, wind, and tidal, they're all intermittent and they all have zero fuel cost. This means that when you start to use this source, you get a stability in the cost, which we don't have with fossil fuels today. Biomass is firmable. It's not intrinsically firm, but it can be made firm by proper management. Hot rock geothermal, which is simply heat that is within the Earth's crust, is the only renewable firm source of energy. But it's highly location dependent. The rest of them are wave, small hydro, and hydrokinetics. And finally, big hydro, which we're all very familiar with here in BC. That is, again, in spite of what you've all experienced in your lives here, not truly firm. It depends on rainfall and snowpack and has to be managed to be firm. BC Hydro spends a lot of time worrying about what's going on in its reservoirs. So there you are. That's what we've got to work with. Now, what this leads you to is a renewable energy system infrastructure, a control system feeding a load, and you have 5 of the intermittent renewable sources, but they're big ones. Solar, wind, these are big sources. There's lots of it around, but they're intermittent. There is, of course, hot rock geothermal. If you have it, it's the firm source, and you can use that. And then you have the 2 renewable, firmable sources, biomass and big hydro. Now, you've got to be able to firm this stuff up. Well, you can always use good old fossil fuel, and what you've done is change the roles. Fossil fuel becomes the alternative energy. It becomes the gap filler. So from an environmental point of view, you're using a lot less of it. All this leads you to a concept. You have 2 renewable sources, in many cases wind and solar, or solar and tidal, or tidal and wind, because they're the big ones. And you have a firming source up here, which fills in the gaps. You'll also need a bridging source, and the reason for that is that the dynamics of these sources turning on and off and whatnot is not instantaneous. So you have to have some way of bridging them. With that, I want to leave you with 3 thoughts. The long-term answer to sustainable global energy system rests in renewable energy sources that are 100% renewable and 100% firm. Secondly, it is possible to create such systems today, but doing so is a very large undertaking. This is not trivial stuff, which means we better start now to learn how to do it. And finally, a thought that relates back to the first thing I said to you. The decisions we make today will determine the ability of our descendants to enjoy the quality of life in their time that we have all had the enormous good fortune to experience in ours. Thank you for your attention.